Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be introducing the topic of the Old Testament. This is a class for Old Testament survey. I'm going to begin with the question, what is, not the Old Testament, but what is the Bible itself? And that word Bible comes from a Greek word, the Greek word biblos. You can actually hear the word Bible in that Bible, biblos. And it means a book, although back when the word was invented, nobody had invented the idea of taking pages and binding them on one side. So when I say book, it could be either a book or a scroll. And the term biblos is used for both. Once they had the invention, they continued to use that. Once they had invented the idea of taking pages and binding them only on one side, like your books, they continued to use that same word biblos. But when we talk about the Bible, we're not just talking about any old book. We're talking specifically about the books that God gave to his people through his people. Notice how I said that. He gave them to his people, but he also gave them through his people. That is, all the books of the Bible had human authors that were involved in the actual writing of the text. We're going to talk about that process in a minute. First, I want to ask the question, how do we know that the right books are in the Bible? And depending on who you ask, if you ask someone with my background, someone from the Protestant or Reformed, group of Christians, they would say there's 66 books in the Bible, both Old and New Testament. If I go and ask my Roman Catholic friends, they'll up that number to 70 some odd. If I go down to Ethiopia, there's a place where I'll ask that question, and they'll come up with 80 some odd books. And so the question is, how do we know that the right books are in the Bible? A number of years ago, this is way back, it had to be 40 or 50 years ago, I think National Geographic was having a slow news month, and they published an article called The Gospel of Judas. Now, it wasn't really written by Judas, and they were pretending that I don't they weren't lying about it, but it made it sound like, at least the cover, like this is a brand new thing. Notice the subtitle, The Lost Version of Christ's Betrayal, and it sounds very mysterious. Actually, it was something very old that archaeologists had found, written by somebody, not by Judas, but by somebody pretending to have some sort of insight into the story of Judas, and they changed the story from what it is in the Bible, and they made Judas the guy that's not so bad, and they introduced their own teachings as if they were biblical teachings. It was trying to sell a point of theology, and let me just say they failed. Okay, and so that's a pretender book. But there are also books that have been set forth that aren't pretenders. They're actually books that were written by certain authors, and they were collected, and we refer to these as the Apocrypha. Now, right now, I'm talking about what the Roman Catholic would refer to as the Apocrypha. If I go down to Ethiopia, there's going to be some other books, and that's going to have to be the topic of a different class. But when we talk about the Apocrypha, notice this was actually, it says the subtitle here, the Compact King James Version. And why does it say that? Because when the folks translated the King James Version in 1611, they translated both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and these extra books that are called the Apocrypha. What's the Apocrypha? It is those books that were written after the Old Testament had been written, but before Jesus was born and before the New Testament was written. And so there were other writings, and they're not necessarily bad writings. In fact, I like some of them because some of them tell the story, the history of what took place after the Old Testament, but before the New Testament. And there was a lot of history that took place. So it's valuable for that reason. And I do teach classes on the Apocrypha, but that's not going to be our topic because our topic is going to be Old Testament. So this term canonicity, the canon, the word canon actually means measuring rod. And it means it's a Greek word, but it's also a Hebrew word. It's actually the same word in Greek and in Hebrew. And that's very, very rare because Greek and Hebrew are two totally different languages. They have almost no words that are the same, but this is one exception to the rule. And a canon was a measuring rod. Now, did the word, was it invented by the Hebrews or by the Greeks or by somebody else, maybe the Phoenicians and the other language groups borrowed it? Maybe. But canonicity then refers to that straight line, that idea of measuring, and it refers to the church's recognition of the authority of the inspired writings. Which books are authoritative? That's the question that canonicity asks. With regard to the Old Testament, Josephus, he's a first century historian. He's Jewish, and he writes about a number of things, but this particular book that he writes is called Contra Appian. Appian was a fellow who didn't like Jewish people, and he had written some nasty things about the Jews, and Josephus is writing his book as a rebuttal to set things straight. And so he says, for we have, and we is speaking of the Jewish people, we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another as the Greeks have, but only 22 books which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. Notice when he talks about those books are divine, these books are from God. And you say 22 books. He's speaking of the Old Testament, but certainly we have 39 books in our Old Testament. What happened to the others? Well, the way the Jewish people count the books, there's only 22, because they take books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, instead of counting that as two books, that's counted as one book, or 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, all the 1st and 2nd, that's, each of those are one book. And then they take Ezra and Nehemiah, they count that as one book. And remember all the minor prophets, there's 12 minor prophets, they just call that the 12, and they count it as one book. So it's really the same books he's speaking of, which comprise our Old Testament, but they're counted a little bit differently. But he continues, and he says, it is true, our history has been written since Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes had been a Persian emperor. And when you say the days of Artaxerxes, that's the days when the Old Testament was completed. And he says, very particularly, but has not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there has not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. He's talking about the Apocrypha. He's talking about the Apocrypha, and he's saying, yes, those are good books. There's nothing wrong with them, but they don't have the same authority. At least we don't believe they have the same authority. And he's not saying he made this up. Notice, by our forefathers. Why? Because there hasn't been an exact succession of prophets since that time. The prophets stopped, and as a result, nobody was giving new word of God. There were no prophets around giving that. And so when these other books came around, they did not have the authority of the prophets, and so they were not considered to have the same authority. And I tend to agree with Josephus. I think the Jewish slant on this was correct. Now, our English Old Testament comprises, we usually set it up into several categories. First, there is what we call the Pentateuch. That just means the five books, and this is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Next, we have those books that we call the historical books, and it picks up right after Deuteronomy. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And with all of those books, you have the entire Old Testament story. But that's not the end of the Old Testament. Next, we have books, and we have labeled them. I'm not sure if this is a good label, but I'm going to go with it, the poetic books. The books of poetry. And the reason I'm not sure that's a good label is because they don't all have a lot of poetry. You have Job, which is mostly poetry. You have Psalms, which is all poetry. Proverbs, all poetry. Ecclesiastes sort of comes back and forth. It's got some poetry, but some parts that are not poetic. And that's why I'm not sure if that's a good designation. But it is wisdom literature, and we'll talk about that when we get there. And finally, Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. Either title works. So those are the poetic books. And then finally, there are the books of prophecy, the prophetic books. And here we go from Isaiah, I'm not going to read them all the way down to Malachi. Remember, the last 12, the Jews count that as the 12, the minor prophets. So I've got the major prophets and the minor prophets. That's the way we usually divide them. And that's our English Old Testament. Now, if I look at a Hebrew Bible, it will be exactly the same books, but they will be arranged differently. So I have the Pentateuch, or if I want to call it the Torah, that I think I like that title a little bit better because it's Hebrew. The word Torah means either law or instruction, sort of both at the same time. And these are the same books that were in the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But next, instead of the historical books, next I have the prophets. In fact, the term for that, the Naviim, that just means prophets. Torah, well, that's the Hebrew, means law or instruction, we already said. The prophets, the way our Jewish friends associate the books, start with Joshua. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Remember, that's First and Second Kings, but I'm just going to call it Kings. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, those minor prophets. That's the prophets. Um, and I can refer to them as the former prophets, like, what we think of as the historical books. And then I can think of the latter prophets, which we usually think of as the prophets, but the same books. Notice Daniel's not in there. Daniel's going to be in a different category. And so this third category are the writings. Now, the way you say that in Hebrew is the ketuvim. That's the writings, and it will include Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, whichever you want to call that one, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel. Remember how we said Ezra and Nehemiah are connected? And finally, Chronicles. So some of those that we think of as historical books, they're actually in the writings. And Chronicles is probably, sometimes we talk about Malachi as the last of the prophets, but it's probably Chronicles that is the last book to be written. Now, I'm not going to say that dogmatically, but the reason I say that is because when I look at the genealogy in First Chronicles chapter 3, it goes for quite a ways, and they had to have been born to make it in the genealogy. So I think Chronicles might be, if not the last, it's near the end, and that fits. Notice how it's at the end of the Hebrew Bible. That's a good place to put it. Next, I want to ask the question, and this is the question we call textual criticism. This is the question: can our copies of the Bible be trusted? After all, every one of the books of the Bible was handwritten and then copied by hand and then a copy was made of the copy, and a copy was made of the copy. And that process went on for quite a bit. And the question comes up, didn't any typos ever get into the text? I know when I've written books, and I've written, some 20 books or so, that in my own writing, and I'm doing this not by hand, I'm doing this by computer, that every once in a while I'll make a typo, and hopefully it gets corrected and fixed. But I made it, and if somebody was just copying off of my copy, probably in most cases they'd say, "Oh, that was a typo. That's easily corrected," and they would correct it. But maybe the typo made sense, and maybe they would actually copy the mistake. And so that's the question here in textual criticism. We look at we don't have any of the original manuscripts, and we probably don't have, and especially with the Old Testament, any original copies. We have copies of copies of copies. And so that process has continued throughout, and it's made it a bit of an issue. Can I trust the copies that we have? And I think that we can, by and large. Now, what helped us is back in 1947, there were some shepherds. If you go down to the area of the Dead Sea is the lowest place on the face of the earth. It's 1,400 feet below sea level. And the area around are these big rock cliffs. And if you look on this picture, you can see a cave up there. And getting up there is pretty difficult. Well, back in 1947, there were a couple of three shepherds, and they were looking for a lost goat, and they didn't know where they'd wandered to. And so one of them picked up a rock, and he tried throwing the rock into some of these caves. And you notice there's a bunch of caves, some big, some not quite so big. And he threw a rock into one particular cave, and instead of hearing bah and the goat running out, he heard this crash, tinkle, tinkle, and he thought, "What on earth is that?" That's not the sound of a rock hitting another rock. That's something artificial up there. And in the meantime, the goat showed up, so he's the hero of our story. But he had pointed out the cave, and it was getting late, so they went home. But this young shepherd boy went back the next day without his friends, his cousins. They were a little bit miffed at him that he'd gone back by himself, and he climbed up into the cave, and he found inside the cave there were a couple of pots, and one was broken with with a stone in it. And inside the pots were some ancient, ancient, ancient scrolls. And so he found these scrolls up in the cave and brought them back home. And eventually they made their way to an antiquities dealer. He was actually a guy that doubled as a shoe salesman, but he was an antiquities dealer, and he gave them some money for the scrolls. And what they had found are what are called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And scholars went back to some of the other caves in the area, and they thought, "Gee, I wonder if there's other scrolls." And sure enough, there were. So right here in this picture, I can see a looks sort of an artificial cave. That's cave 4. What they did is they numbered them, and anytime they found a cave with scrolls in it, they gave it a number, and by this time they'd gotten up to 4 and 5. You see 2 caves there, and they had found these what are called the Dead Sea Scrolls, and these scrolls were 1,000 years older than anything that scholars already had. They dated back to the time of Jesus and earlier in most cases. So here we are. Again, you can see cave number 4 in the distance there. There had been a community there called the Qumran community. And now it's believed that this Jewish community living there in the days of Jesus and earlier, that some of these scrolls were penned 100 or around 200 years uh, before Jesus, but most of them more recently. But most of them before the days of Jesus. And they had hidden the scrolls in these caves at different times. And so here is one of the scrolls that they found. This is one of the Isaiah scrolls, the entire book of Isaiah. They actually found 2 books initially of Isaiah. They found books of Genesis, of Psalms. Eventually, they found pieces, at least, usually not an entire scroll, but pieces of almost every book in the Hebrew Bible. Nothing in the New Testament that hadn't been written yet. But the Hebrew Bible, I think Esther is the only one they've never found a piece of. They found a little tiny scrap, and they thought, well, maybe that's Esther. There were so few letters you couldn't really tell. But as far to the best of my knowledge, Esther they never found. And when I say every book, remember I'm counting. I'm counting the minor prophets as one book. They didn't find every one of the minor prophets, but they found a lot of scrolls. And when they compared these with what they already had, they were very, very, very close. The text had not been substantially changed. It was the same story. It was the same Bible. Now, I'm not saying there weren't a few typos along the way. Yes, there were, but by and large, everything was the same, and it really gave hope that the Bible that we have is really quite accurate. That our Jewish friends had done a very careful job over 1,000 years of copying the text very accurately. Next, we come to the question of hermeneutics. Now, I always ask my students, who is Herman and what does he have to do with the science of interpretation? Because that's what the word hermeneutics means. Well, we get the term from the Greek god Hermes. He was the messenger god. So this is the science of the message, of trying to interpret the message. And this is the question of interpretation. How do I read the Bible and correctly interpret it, correctly understand it? And there are some fundamental questions that we ask in this area of hermeneutics. First of all, we ask the question, what did it mean to the original characters of the narrative? So, for example, if I'm reading about David and Goliath, I would ask, well, what kind of background does Goliath have? And what about David? And what did the story mean to them? And then I would ask the question, what does it mean to the author? Because the person who wrote the book is not necessarily one of the characters in the book. Once in a while, it could be. For example, in the book of Ezra, the latter part starting in chapter 7, I have Ezra speaking in the first person. He says, I, Ezra, was doing this and I was doing that. And so it's really the same character. But usually, most books are written by somebody else. And what did this story mean to that person? Sometimes we know who that person is, sometimes we don't, but we can still make a good qualified understanding of what it would have meant to the author of that day. But then we ask, what did it mean to the original recipients of the book? Every book has intended recipients, it's written to a particular audience. And what does this mean to that particular audience? Well, let's go back to that question, the audience and the writer and the readers. And I'm taking us right now to the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden being cast out of the garden. The author, I take it to be Moses. We call those books the books of Moses. Now, I do think somebody came along after Moses and edited, maybe added a little bit. The reason I say that is because in Deuteronomy, at the very end of the book, Moses dies. I don't think he wrote that part. And I suspect that there's a section over in the book of Numbers where it says Moses was the most humble man in all of Israel. I think maybe he didn't write that either. That doesn't sound like something that would be written about by a humble man about himself. But still, I think it's mostly comes from Moses, and he's writing to the Israelites who have just come out of Egypt, because that's the Israelites that he knew, who are in the wilderness, and they're going to get the tabernacle, and they're going to get the story from God. And Moses is writing with that as his audience. And so when we read about the story of Adam and Eve who have come out of the garden, we're reading it through the eyes of some people who have come out of a garden-like place. The land of Egypt was like a garden if you were right along the Nile, and that's where they had lived. And now they've come out of their garden into a very difficult place, into the wilderness itself. And they can identify with Adam and Eve in that regard. Now, we have it in our Bible, and as we are reading the Bible, we're not Moses, we're not the Israelites, we're living many thousands of years later. So readers today need to, at least in part, put themselves into the sandals of the original writer and the original readers to better understand the story. And we're going to try to do that in a few places as we read through the Old Testament story. So, what did it mean to the original recipients? That was the last question we asked. And finally, what does it mean in light of New Testament revelation? You see, the New Testament hadn't been written in the days of the Hebrew Bible, but it comes along and gives us further insights, and it's okay to take those insights into account. First, I think we want to try to read it without those insights, but then we'll come back and bring those New Testament insights and see what else we see in the story. And I think that's going to be helpful at all. If we do that, I think we're going to see something that we might not notice the first time through, although I'm going to try to point it out as we go. That the Old Testament is actually going to tell us about the future Messiah. It's going to tell us about Jesus. And so I'm going to suggest we're going to see Jesus in the Old Testament. In fact, the Old Testament was the Bible that Jesus used. And so we're going to see his use of it, but we're also going to see how it tells a story by means of foretelling things. That's going to be prophecy. And also prefiguring things. We're going to see a pattern sets up that is fulfilled in the life and story and person of Jesus.